It's good to see you all this morning, and thank you for bringing me and us into your homes and your workplaces and perhaps the beach, if that's where you are in your virtual background. I love going to the beach, love when people take me there. Beverly, your background looks like a swimming pool for some reason to me, so I feel like I'm doing some aquatics. So it's good to see you. My name again is Alina Scheim. I'm the executive director and an instructor with Resolve. We have a couple Resolve staff in the room with us, including Jorge, who's waving at you, who will be helping with the chat and catching things that I might miss, etc., and responding. So thank you all for being here and being a part of this conversation. I'm going to talk a little bit about Resolve and then get into the work that we're going to do today and actually ask you some questions too in a second. So Resolve, if you aren't familiar with our work, we used to be called Impact. We're based in Santa Fe. And we do violence prevention. And the way we think of that is as two wings of a bird. One wing is about hopefully making it so that people simply do not grow up to create harm, what's called primary prevention, if you're familiar with that term. So we do a lot of anti-bias, anti-bullying, work with schools and communities in that way, and also bystander intervention. The other wing of the bird is really focused on the fact that some of us are targeted more often for violence, and it's not enough to wait for the world to become a better place. We need the tools to navigate the world that we live in now. And so for us, it's really important that we're not doing one or the other, that we're always thinking of doing both. And our disability work follows that same pattern. So on one side, we're doing trainings like this about how to support and show up better for people with disabilities in our lives and in our communities and for ourselves. The other side is our Impactability and Powerful People program, where students with disabilities, regardless of ability level, are practicing asserting themselves, acting when something happens that they don't want, whether it's unwanted touch or the way someone is speaking to them, and accessing help and reporting. Jorge, is there anything you want to add about that? Okay.
That's pretty good.
Great. I saw your face there, so I thought I'd ask.
I'm here.
Awesome. Thank you. So, so the work that we are doing today is a part of that work of creating a safer climate for people with disabilities by better understanding how to make a safer community for them. So, and this is my apology, I should have made this into a poll. I know a bunch of you have already introduced yourselves, but if you could put in the chat either privately to me or to the group of your experience with disability, whether that is experience with having a disability yourself or chronic illness or a family member, and or that you do the work professionally and work with students with disabilities. That would be great. Oh, and if you've ever attended or taught a session like this before. So just your experience with disability and disability justice concepts. And I'll just wait a second for people to type that. Thank you. Awesome. Great. I know a lot of you, since so many of you are social workers, do direct work with disabilities often. Great. Great. Just gonna wait one more second for those to come in. Okay. Great. Awesome. You may hear my toddler trying to invade the room in the background. We are currently in quarantine right now And so our house is full of more noises than it usually is at this time of day. Okay. So feel free to keep chatting. I'm fairly good at reading and talking at the same time, which is a weird thing. Sometimes I go too far with that. Awesome. So I want to talk about access needs for today and in general and our space. So I typically do ask ahead of time. It was a little harder for this to ask ahead of time. If there are any things beyond taking space for yourself, turning off your camera, etc., that would help you access the space. If I need to speak louder or turn up my mic, or if sometimes it's useful to see things written out, uh, anything like that, please, again, you can type it to me privately or to the group. In an hour and a half slot, I usually do not take time for a break, but if you and your body need a break, please take that for yourself. That can be either walking away entirely for a minute and using the bathroom, getting water, etc., or just turning off the camera, etc., whatever you need to do. One thing that I think is really important, when we started asking about access needs in our organization, we found that a lot of times people would say, oh, I don't have any access needs. I don't have any access needs. And then, and then there'd be the person that would be like, well, I pee a lot. I do need bathroom breaks. And they would kind of say it as a joke, but also kind of say it as true. And so I think it's really important that we just acknowledge everyone has access needs. Just some access needs we expect to be covered already when we enter a space, and some we don't. And so that's why asking more proactively overall can be so useful and can be a good practice. And simply saying, I expect my access needs to be met rather than I have no access needs is a more helpful statement to make. So please let me know if there are any more access needs that might be useful for you. I want to talk about our space in regards to stories. So a lot of times, many of us with a variety of identities have been told or coached or learned that telling stories, and oftentimes telling stories of harm or being mistreated, is the only way that we can access care, that we can access someone helping us and getting our needs met. And I want to explicitly ask that we actually don't share stories. I won't be sharing any detailed stories of specific instances of abuse. That always comes up when we're talking about disability, and particularly our lens of talking about disability, which is around violence prevention. But I want to do that for two reasons. One, I believe you. I believe the people whose stories you've heard. And I don't think we need to know the stories to believe that you need care and that other people need care. We aren't able to create a really good container in this space and to give stories the dignity that they deserve. And so that's one reason why we ask for that. The other reason is that oftentimes we're told that people with disabilities the message that we oftentimes get is that people with disabilities are there for our consumption, which means that their stories are there for our consumption. So I just want to have a space in which we're not doing that. I will be telling some instances of violence or mistreatment or slurs, but in broad ways, not in specific ways. Does anyone have any questions or clarifications on that? Okay, cool. And oftentimes what happens is that we get carried away and it starts coming out of our mouths. So if that happens, I'll just remind you. Cool. So I want to talk about history for a couple reasons to start. One, history is always with us, right? This is how we came to be where we are today. And it shapes our beliefs. It shapes what we know and what we don't know. It shapes also how our words impact others. Sometimes you may have had the experience of saying something or doing something or noticing that being done, and it feels like it's really small, like a microaggression, but there's a depth of impact that comes from that history. So that's why I always think history is useful, and it's important to give dignity to that, to those stories. So I want to ask, as a starting place, are any of you familiar with circuses in regards to disability and how those two connect, the history of circuses? I see some yeses, some nos. Those of you who are nodding yes, whether your camera is on or off, do you want to unmute or chat and say anything about what you do now? I always love when we can co-create the stories together. Okay, so I'll start. I never know if people are typing, I always imagine. Okay, great. Thank you, Anna. So I like read into people's body language, by the way, so I'll like pretend that I can see you typing even though I can't actually see your hands. So so I'll start, and if anyone wants to jump in, that's great. So circuses, in this model, this is from the 1900s or so, were done with people, right, with the model of a freak show, quote unquote freak show. And it was for gawking, it was for looking for abnormalities or things to, sorry, I'm just getting distracted by my notes for a second. So it was looking for things that were different, that were considered a spectacle as a form of entertainment. And as you can see, and as many other photos show, a lot of those interpretations of the range of human experiences were oftentimes racialized, very highly racialized. They were oftentimes caused by disease or illness, and oftentimes related to gender and not conforming to typical ideas of what gender expression should look like, or different bodies that fell outside of that binary thought. And so in this way, you can actually see really early on why the disability movement has always been intrinsically related to folks who are chronically ill, etc. And also the intersectional aspect of it in terms of racism, in terms of homophobia and transphobia and sexism. Now, one thing that I think is really interesting about the circus movement is that some people note that during the time of the circus, and this is not everyone with a disability, right? This is everyone with a more physical, shown, visible disability who worked in the circus. But one thing that's really interesting about that time is some people note that people who worked in the circus actually had more access to money and more access to their own money and being in control of it than they do now with government benefits. And so I think that's a really fascinating thing. And to be clear, not everyone, right? Not everyone had access to that, but they did also have access to community in this way that wasn't as isolating as it was for other folks during that time. Now, to be sure, right, being gawked at, being objectified in such a clear way is not desirable. But I just think it's interesting to hold that complexity of, oh, wow, but they were more financially independent than many people are living with disability today. Does anyone have anything they want to add to that? Questions? Okay. So is anyone familiar with the eugenics movement and how it relates to disability? I see a couple nods. Okay. So
can I make a comment? Oh,
sorry, will you say that again, Anna?
I would like to clarify that just because a person is born with a disability does not necessarily mean that they are part of the system and that throughout their life they have acquired money. But they can be part of the circus of life because of the medical profession. But that does not mean that everybody with a disability requires financial support from the government.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. So yes, and that's absolutely true. Just as during the time of the circus, not everyone had access to that, nor was it desirable. It's still true now that not everyone, and in fact, very few people with disabilities have access to government support. So, and I want to mention, actually, you said something, Anna, that reminded me that this movement, this kind of objectification consumption concept shifted from the idea of an oddity to be looked at to a medical model of something to be treated. And so that's where the circuses died out in that respect. So that brings us to this movement. So anything you know or want to share about the history of eugenics in relation to disability? Okay, so a lot of times our knowledge in the United States relating to eugenics brings to mind Hitler and the Nazi movement. And what a lot of people don't know is that Hitler actually got the idea from us, from the United States. We did it first. And so here you can see, here you can see the state criteria for legal eugenical sterilization. And this is, right, this is with the idea of the phrases that were used with it were concepts of racial hygiene, of creating a better race. You can still hear that language echoed today from the eugenics movement with concepts of a sick world or clean eating, just like we understand concepts of good and bad and light and dark, and the ways those are infused with other understandings and biases. We also have the term Asperger's, which thankfully has gone out of favor. I've been hearing it far less than it used to be. And the reason it went out of favor is actually it was a doctor's name in concentration camps in Nazi Germany. And Asperger's and that low functioning, high functioning, which is now considered a slur or hate speech by many people with disabilities, comes from the idea of who's useful to society and who's not, right? Which is deeply, deeply related to eugenics and other threads like just capitalism and making a living in our country. So a lot of the work that we're talking about today comes from Sebastian Margaret, who works for Resolve, is on sabbatical while they do disability justice and LGBTQ organizing nationwide right now with a great fellowship. And I love this phrase, this definition of ableism that they have, which is disability, the familiar made strange, the strange made dangerous, and then disposable. And I like that definition because as many of you already reflected, this is who we are, right? We are a very diverse group of people on this planet who encompass people with disabilities, family members with disabilities, many students that you work with disabilities. And this is the fabric of our community, but oftentimes that separation and that isolation, as we're going to be talking about today, makes what is actually a very ordinary part of our community separated and not understood. And when we don't understand things, it is easier to mistreat people. So I want to ask you, when we talk about a single story, who's typically represented when we talk about disability? How do we typically see that if we see a brochure or a TV show, etc.? Like the most frequent, not the one you see every once in a while, the most frequent. And again, you can unmute, we're a small enough group, or you can type in the chat. Yeah, someone in a wheelchair, pretty much always, right? And we can talk about why do you think that is? Why do you think the wheelchair is used as the symbol for disability? When actually it's only about 5% of people with disabilities that use wheelchairs or mobility devices. Yeah, it's more visible, right? It's very true, especially, you know, I think of even folks, right, with really good intentions when Resolve tried to start describing the work that we do with folks with disabilities in the community. It was one of those pieces um, where we looked at, like, how can we immediately make this known, and that is the easiest one to notice. The challenge in a single story is that oftentimes it means that we don't see ourselves in that image and that we don't see others in that image. And so unfortunately, that oftentimes relates to access to care. I did this presentation a month or two ago, actually, for a disability services organization. And I asked at the beginning, how many of you have a disability, et cetera, the same questions that we asked you today. And a number of them were like, maybe, sort of, kind of. And then when we got to this piece in the presentation, they spoke so clearly about how harmful it is to not be represented. And I was like, wow, this is astounding that we work in this field, and this is true for me too, as someone who has increasingly less ability and less access, that oftentimes, even doing this work, oftentimes we've heard that story, that narrative of what counts as a disability often enough that despite knowing it kind of intimately, we forget to count ourselves because it doesn't seem like it counts. And so that has implications for access to care, right? And to the ways that we treat one another, of whether someone is disabled enough, right? Whether someone can park in an accessible parking spot without getting yelled at, or whether someone can stand up from a wheelchair for a moment to get something off the shelf without someone scolding them for being more able than they let on, right? And so the other thing that I want to note is that evolution, language is constantly evolving, and it's evolving actually really quickly now because of the ability to organize in a way that was not possible a couple decades ago because of the internet, because um, physical access was no longer a barrier for people connecting and making a movement. Certainly there's lots of things in the internet that are access barriers, but often for the disability justice movement and disability rights movement, being able to organize online has made it move light years ahead. So if you have the experience of being like, this was like totally a good thing to say like 2 years ago, and now it sounds like maybe it's not you. It's just the way of things. The other thing is that people are diverse, obviously, and so oftentimes you may have the experience of someone saying that they prefer language that is not the language that I'm using here. Great, use the language that people like best, right? Ask people what they want to be called, what kind of language. No group is a monolith, right? Yeah, thanks for adding that, Anna. And is it Anna or Anna? I just want to make sure I'm saying it right.
It's Anna.
Okay, thank you for letting me know.
People call me Anna too.
Okay, so I want to talk about language so that we're all using the same language going forward. So I want to talk about impairment. Impairment is a physiological truth about a person's body and or mind. It's a description about a difference or body-mind variation. Ableism is a power-based system founded in the belief of the superiority of able-bodied people, the materials, social, and attitudinal conditions in the world that restrict, limit, and oppress people with disabilities. And one thing that I want to note about ableism in the context of what we're talking about today is that for many people, ableism is the last ism of social justice language that people learn more about. Oftentimes we learn more about racism or sexism, homophobia, etc. Ableism is oftentimes the last in that, again, relating to that internet and organizing piece. And the hope is with doing this conversation is that we get educated about it before we experience it ourselves. Because the reality is many of us, as we grow older, will lose ability. And my hope is that for me, I did not know as much about it and had a lot of ignorance about it, frankly, before it started affecting me. And so I just hope that for others. So you may have the experience of being like, wow, I understand a lot of different pieces of oppression that really relate to this and intersect with this. And that's great. That's another lens for seeing things. Disability is a term of self-identity to community, history, culture, and pride. For some, it's also a source of advocacy and resistance against a value system that dehumanizes. And we'll be speaking about the word disability more as we go on. And then finally, access, the practical implementation of universal access, the societal attitude of full inclusion and engaged anti-ableism. Okay, so my disabled body is not a burden. So for a lot of us, we've heard many narratives about disability, and that can be slurs that we've heard, stories about how it came to be, whether it was a curse or the evil eye, something to be cured, something to get rid of. So I'm going to talk about that thread of understanding disability as a burden, as something bad that's happened or to be gotten rid of. So one thing that's true is that we as a society, we as people want to control things we don't understand. We want to contain them. This is a picture of an institution or an asylum from long ago. It's black and white. And this is the legacy, and this is still what's going on, whether that's called a home or an asylum or warehousing people, all of those things. And one thing, just as an anti-violence organization talking about this, just the words that are on the screen: control, compliance, and isolation. Those are words that are a feature of many people who are disabled, and they are inherently, control, compliance, and isolation are inherently huge risk factors for violence, as many of you in your work already know. And one of the ways that compliance issue comes up is compliance is access to care, right? It's not only not getting mistreated for acting out or not behaving as others desire, but it's also the ways that children, whether in a home or accessing services, can earn points and earn favor and access. And so one of the challenges that we see and that we know is a huge risk factor then for students with disabilities is that it's just true, right? It's true if you have multiple kids in a home, or in a school setting is that when students behave, when they do what you ask them to do, things are easier. But oftentimes the way that plays out for young people is that they learn that they have to do whatever they're told. And that becomes a problem when someone tells them to do something that they used to know in their gut that wasn't something that they felt okay for them to do. So they're so high maintenance. By the way, I know that reading, I don't put a lot of words on slides for access reasons, but I do intentionally read the words that I do put on slides just in case not everyone can read or read English, etc., or process information at the same time. So as a practice, I wanted to let you know that I'm doing that intentionally. So this oftentimes comes up in particular for folks who have chronic illnesses, who oftentimes have more particular needs in order to stay healthy. So a fear of being perceived as needy. Oftentimes there's this phrase of special needs, right? And I know that this is always a challenge when talking in the schools because special ed is just a phrase now, right? But oftentimes that phrase special, the question that comes up is, does that mean that those are extra needs or not totally important needs to meet versus, again, everyone has particular needs, right? And then what we talked about earlier in terms of anticipated needs versus needing to say. Oftentimes when someone has what's perceived as more needs than others, when we ask for access needs, oftentimes what's stated is only a fraction of what they actually need or what we actually need because of that fear of being seen as needy or too much of a trouble. And so that's where making it so that everyone's asked what their needs are versus having to proactively say that out loud can be very helpful. And I know a lot of you are already doing that. And then the thing that I think is really great about the disability justice movement is it talks about how, right, it's that concept of margins to center. If we serve the person with the most needs, if we serve a Black trans disabled woman's needs, the likelihood of being able to meet the needs of someone who's white and cisgender, doesn't have any disabilities, etc., is just exceedingly likely. And so the more that we broaden the idea of how to meet needs for everyone, it means that, because this is I think an interesting thing, is that being called needy is kind of a slur, an equal opportunity slur, right? It can be used in a relationship, in a friendship, in a classroom, and it's used exceedingly often for people with disabilities and chronic illnesses, but or implied, but it can be used against anyone. Okay, so this is a poster or a piece of artwork that was made by Micah Bazant. It says, "Justice for Mario Woods. Over 50% of people killed by police are disabled. Disability justice now. Black disabled lives matter." So I think that this is something that's really interesting. Were any of you aware of that statistic? It's true for a lot of us that even while police brutality against Black people, against Indigenous people, and other people of color has been surfaced and been talked about a lot more, oftentimes the missing aspect that isn't talked about as much is that many people have those intersections of identities of being Black, Indigenous, person of color, and also having a disability. Do you all remember Elijah? I'm blanking on his last name, in Colorado. He was killed probably a little bit before the pandemic by the police. So it's interesting. I see Katrina nodding. I don't know if any of the rest of you are. He was one of the few people with disabilities that were killed by the police where the disability actually came out. Many times, and this is true actually very, very much in Albuquerque, where we have um, a huge, huge problem with police brutality, is that if you read the newspaper, oftentimes it'll be kind of buried in that moment of police brutality uh, to to see that, oh, they were autistic, or oh, um, they had a mental illness, etc. Yeah, thank you for adding that, Anna. It's true. So she said that diabetics are often assumed to be drunk when they're needing help for a medical condition and arrested. And that's oftentimes true, period, right? Police are oftentimes called in mental health emergencies, or when a parent is finding it challenging to meet the needs of their autistic child, etc. And the hope is that help will be accessed, and that's not what happens. And a lot of times what happens, thank you, Elijah McLean. Um, and a lot of times that is what happens is because the lens of quote unquote normal behavior is so narrow that anything outside of that is deemed erratic or rude or disrespectful. And the impulse then is to control it. And that's a super dangerous impulse for people who hold guns, right? And who are in that position. And that carries out over to school pushout. Absolutely still to the school to prison pipeline explicitly, but just school pushout in general is something that, again, we oftentimes have the conversation about, thankfully, about young students of color and low-income students. But oftentimes that cross-section, that lived experience of multiple marginalities isn't discussed as much. Does anyone have anything they want to add or go into here?
So just based off of what you just said, how can we bring that conversation more to the forefront? Because I think I work with a lot of students who meet at that cross section.
Yeah,
And
totally.
yeah, it's a lot of talking about either one thing or the other, but not bringing that conversation together, and therefore not talking about creative opportunities and solutions.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, I think exactly what you said is talking about it, is saying like, wow, I noticed we have more white students with diagnoses that help us understand their behavior. And this child doesn't have a diagnosis, but is acting in these ways that I wonder about. So sometimes simply access to diagnosis can be a part of it. Um, and then some of it can be also just acknowledging like, wow, I wonder about why we're making accommodations for here and not here, or just saying, naming it. Some of the rest of what we're going into, I think, will also help have some language to go into it more, I hope. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, and feel for sure bring that up again if you want as we go further. Okay, so this is another, have you all heard this, identity as slang? So like, oh, I'm so OCD, she's totally bipolar, don't be psycho, right? All of these kinds of language that oftentimes they're not saying, right? To be clear, enjoying order, that's not OCD, right? Um, being sad for a day is not depressed. And so um, helping us figure out that language, we can see actually a lot of this in the last 5 years. There've been a lot of memes and language to describe people in the news and in political offices as psycho or psychotic, etc. when really the word that people are looking for is racist or white supremacist patterns. And to be really clear, racism is not a mental health diagnosis, right? It's something that needs to be dealt with in society, but it's not the same thing. And what happens is when these words are normalized in this way, it sends a super clear message to people with mental health or other diagnoses that that we're not welcome, right? That we're not going to be treated well if we share these things about ourselves. So this is a great area, especially in schools where this kind of language is super normal. Folks don't know. Talking with students, folks oftentimes don't know the impact of the word or even where the word comes from oftentimes. I know that that was true for me with some language that I used in the past and had no clue that it had ties, what its ties were to. So infantilization is a really common phenomenon with people with disabilities. And since so many of you are doing the work yourselves and or have a disability, I want to ask you, how do you see this happening? How do you see people who are older than children being treated like children still when they have a disability?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question is, how is it that people with disabilities are oftentimes infantilized or treated like children? How does that play out? Because it's a super common phenomenon.
Because they assume that if you're disabled, you're not intelligent, that
Mm-hmm,
you're infantile.
mm-hmm. Right. So assumptions of intelligence related to some other presentation, right? Um, and oh, there was something I wanted to say about that. Oh, and that comes on a, makes me think of like people doing staging of, oh, they're really 5, they're really 7, etc. for people with intellectual or developmental disabilities. And we hear this all the time. And it used to be common, it used to be more encouraged. But what happens is then, one of the things that we are involved with is sex ed in the schools. And we were at a parent night recently and someone said, I don't want you teaching my child, my 8th grader, about like how much are you going to tell them because they still like Mickey Mouse and stuff. And the person responding said, oh, don't worry, we're really not going to go into it. We're just going to talk about body stuff, but not about sex. And that's some of that thinking that's getting corrected or moved away from now, is going into, no, we need to treat people in regards to their chronological age, not some perception about ability. Other ways that you notice this coming up, and it can be like super subtle, like how are students taught sometimes? Yeah, being told not to date or assume that they don't have an interest in dating. Absolutely. Not involving people with disabilities in decision making. Exactly. Or even when they do make a decision, doubting it and not being sure that they really thought it through, right? Other ones that come up a lot is speaking for them. Oftentimes that'll be something that, again, all of this comes from care. And I just want to acknowledge that it all comes from a place of care of, an adult or like a parent or a provider knowing that sometimes their young people or their students aren't understood. And so wanting to speak quickly to interpret what the student has just said so as to lessen the shame or embarrassment or the harsh asking for people to repeat themselves, etc. instead of actually just letting people around them learn and seeing if the people around them show up, right? So a lot of these things are totally protective impulses. Oftentimes touching, quite often, is something that we do. Touching without consent is something that we do in our culture, unfortunately, with children, and that is repeated a lot for adults with disabilities of all ages. Cute is one of those funny things, cute and sweet. One of my favorite ones that comes out sometimes is like, if you don't call the rest of your middle schoolers cute, and you call some students cute, that might be a sign. Some people are like, no, I think all middle schoolers are really sweet and cute. I'm like, okay, great. But you know, it can be a way of just kind of being like, huh, that just came out of my mouth, and you're right, I wouldn't say that about other students. So I like this drawing. It says spectators, and it has a picture of someone who's using a wheelchair, and it says crowd cheering. Yo, I gotta post this. No excuse. Hashtag no excuses. Handy capable, and lots of clapping. And so one of the things that oftentimes doesn't seem like a bad thing is that oftentimes folks with disabilities experience the bar being set super low, and or being thought of as inspiration. And we're going to get into that in just a second. So either the bar is really low, and then when they do anything, it's like, oh, that's amazing, instead of just thinking about the everyday brilliance of navigating this world that everyone has. So this says, what's in a name? Disabled, hashtag say the word. And then the next picture has a picture of a circle with a line through it that says physically challenged, differently abled, disability, mentally challenged, handicapable, special needs. And then it says in bold, disabled or has a disability. So this is super, super common that we've gotten into this euphemistic language. And this is true, actually. I would include in that special needs, special ed, IEP, etc. That, you know, I've been talking, I had an experience recently of talking with a school about a student, and they said, you know, oh, they have an IEP, et cetera, et cetera. And they never really told me what the student's needs were. And it's challenging because on one hand, we need to actually know what needs need to be met, right? That's an important aspect. And we also, the reason all of these euphemisms got created, well, actually, let me ask you, why do you think all these euphemisms got created? What were people thinking in creating like differently abled, physically challenged, handicapable, all of that stuff? What was the goal there? Trying to be supportive, totally. Trying to take care of their feelings, yep. Yeah, thank you for saying that, Nicole. An optimistic spin. I like that as like an optimistic spin, totally. So yeah, the idea was, and this is by people without disabilities, right? Is oftentimes people, and you probably know this from your work experience, oftentimes people will put off getting a diagnosis because they know that people with disabilities are treated badly. Until they say, you know what, I don't want to know that word is associated. I want this child to have as quote unquote normal of an experience as possible, which is really admirable. It's really lovely. It's lovely to want to protect children from harm. And I think that the challenge there is disability can be access. It can be, using the word disability can mean understanding why people are treating me badly. It can be understanding that there's other people like me, right? there's a lot of opportunity in words. And when we use euphemisms, what we end up doing is taking away the ability to, well, I'll talk about this on the next slide. So saying the word disability, it communicates what's true. The word disability is not positive or negative. And I hear this a lot from folks who are really, as parents and staff members, really trying to figure out, like, I don't want to make my child or this child think that there's something wrong with them. And the thing is there's not anything wrong. It's just a truth, right? Just as it's true that I have brown hair, it's just an aspect. The thing that makes it negative is the interpretation of disability as bad. Saying the word disability also helps name ableism. It's really challenging to name why things are harder for us, or why we're treated poorly if we don't have the name for how we're different. And then it gives access to community and ability to organize, right? I think of just other things, other phrases that were not spoken about and are now spoken about. Naming something makes it easier to find other people like us, and to connect and to get support for our everyday experiences, as well as to try to change the conditions we live in. And this is a really interesting thing, actually, about disability, is that many identities are shared through families, right? Racial identities, religious identities, but oftentimes disabilities and abilities are not necessarily shared. And so oftentimes people with disabilities do not have mentors in their families to understand how to approach their identity, to figure out how to organize, how to understand it and move through this world in the ways that other folks with other marginalized identities don't always get, but may get in their families. So I love this quote. It's from Jim Sinclair from Don't Mourn for Us. You can find a much longer version on YouTube. This is an excerpt from it. It says, autism isn't something a person has or a shell that a person is trapped inside. There's no normal child hidden behind the autism. Autism is a way of being. It is pervasive. It colors every experience, every sensation, perception, thought, emotion, and encounter, every aspect of existence. It is not possible to separate the autism from the person. And if it were possible, the person you'd have left would not be the same person you started with. This is important, so take a moment to consider it. Autism is a way of being. It is not possible to separate the person from the autism. Therefore, when parents say, I wish my child did not have autism, what they're really saying is, I wish the autistic child I have did not exist, and I had a different, non-autistic child instead. So I really like that. If you watch his longer YouTube video, there's a couple versions of it. He does talk about how it's normal to mourn for expectations that we had before someone was born versus who we have. And we know people mourn for hopes and dreams in lots of ways. But I appreciate that piece of, again, oftentimes parents of children with disabilities don't have a lot of mentorship with how to approach their child with disabilities. They have ideas about how to access services, but oftentimes not this piece behind it. Have any of you heard of the concept of inspiration porn? We've heard that phrase before. Jorge, do you want to read some of these slides for me?
Yes, also there's a comment in the
Oh, thank you.
chat by Anna, if you want to take a look at that. So the first image on the left, so what's your excuse again? And then the right, never ignore somebody with a disability. You don't realize how much they can inspire you. Share it if you agree. And the lower left is like, he asked her to prom even in her condition. Like and share equals respect.
So who were these images created for? Who are they supposed to inspire? Again, you can unmute or chat box. Were they supposed to inspire people with disabilities or people without disabilities? Yeah, people without disabilities, right? And probably not created by the people in the images, right? Not so created by people without disabilities. And how are we, if we think of that bottom left picture, how are we supposed to feel about the young man who's standing? And how are we supposed to feel about the young woman who's sitting? Knight in shining armor, that he's providing an act of charity. And how are we supposed to feel about her? An amazing opportunity. That's generous. That's a generous way of saying it, that she's lucky that she's being given a gift. Yeah. So, and for all we know, he could be the biggest schmuck, and right, she could be the one doing him a favor. We don't know more about this story, and yet there's a really clear implied message here about pity, about being a savior, etc. And the question oftentimes when we look at inspiration porn is that is about one, the idea that people have to be inspirational in order to be worthy, in order for their lives to be worth living, right? That's not asked of people without disabilities. Certainly some people are outstanding in some ways, but people with disabilities, oftentimes it is a justification for lives being worth living. And there's that message, right? If we watch movies, when there's someone who's has a disability or someone who's blind or deaf, they have to be inspirational, they have to be brilliant, they're a savant in some way. Instead of just, again, the complexity of having needs, not being inspirational, being kind of frustrating sometimes, and being really interesting and smart in many ways other times. And the question then oftentimes is, would this image be shared otherwise? So I think this is interesting because a lot of us are motivated for wanting representation, right? Whether we want that for ourselves or we know that's a good thing and want it for others. And so thinking of representation versus inspiration, one of the questions is, would it be shared otherwise? I got into this very funny conversation about this image that was shared, I don't know, 1 million or so times, more or less, on social media with a group of people. And I was like, this drawing isn't that extraordinary. And the people in the room were like, yes, it is. It's an amazing painting. Not a drawing, a painting. And it's a lovely painting, but would this photo have been shared if not for this child's disability? Certainly it would have been shared like with friends and family, but wouldn't have been shared 1 million times, right? So Oftentimes that's the way of knowing. Versus if you think of someone like Frida Kahlo, who did live with a disability and was a brilliant artist. And oftentimes what I think is interesting is when we compress people's stories, because that's what happens. Oftentimes Frida's story is compressed into brilliant artist or, oh, she had a disability, but oftentimes those two aren't held at the same time. And one of the reasons I actually like this photo a lot is that it captures everything at once. It captures the logistics of how she needed to work in order to do the painting and her amazing artwork, that she did it from bed. There's a lot that we don't actually know in this picture. We don't know if maybe she had a bedpan underneath her. We don't know if this young man was posing for a picture, if he was a family member just coming to check out what she was doing, or if he was helping her with access in some way. So I actually really, not that this has to be the picture that's shown every time we talk about Frida. You like that I'm on a first name basis with her now. So not that we have to, talk about it every time we speak of her, show this picture, but I think it is interesting for capturing both truths. Jorge, do you want to read this one?
Yes. That quote, "The only disability in life is a bad attitude." The reason that's bullshit is no amount of smiling on a flight of stairs has ever made it turn into a ramp. No amount of standing in the middle of a bookshelf and radiating a positive attitude is going to turn all those books into Braille. Stella Young.
Cool. I love this quote by Stella because it goes into, I'm on a first name basis with everyone now. I like this quote of hers because it talks both about that idea of toxic positivity, that we can just like, maybe if we take enough essential oils, then maybe that will go away, or eat enough kale, maybe these things will suddenly disappear, or just think positively. So it addresses toxic positivity, and it also talks about it starts to go into the social model of disability, which I really like. So one of the questions of the social model of disability says, again, if we're tracing it historically, there's the kind of circus concept of it, of like freak show, something to be observed and consumed, to a medical model, to now we're moving into the social model time. And the social model says, if we take the example of stairs and mobility, that says, in fact, this is, sorry, I'm gonna take a second. The person first language versus identity first language. So some people prefer, I'm a person with a disability, and other people say, no, I'm a disabled person. And one of my favorite pieces for why people argue for the I'm a disabled person identity first language is because it says, for someone in a wheelchair, for example, if there was an elevator and a ramp in this building, I wouldn't be disabled. I would have total access. The only thing that makes me disabled is the environment that does not accommodate me. Does that make sense? I saw some folks nodding to that. And so I really like that concept. Just to say, people use both. Again, figure out what language. Obviously, the person with the disability or the person who's disabled gets to decide. But one of the things that I think the social model brings up that it really offers the movement is it says, are we trying to understand and accept and accommodate differences, or are we working to change them? So a medical model towards autism, as an example, is we need to fix this. We need to make it so that they are completely indistinguishable from their peers, so that they make eye contact, so that they learn how to speak in their turn and how to stay on topic without dwelling too long on other topics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas a social model says, oh, some features of autism include having difficulty making eye contact, seeking or avoiding sensation, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just a feature instead of, it's a descriptor rather than a something to be changed. And the thing, if identity first language feels like ooh to you, I just want to offer that we do use identity first language in other examples. So just like saying I'm a disabled person, I also say that I'm a white person. I say that I'm a Jewish woman, right? These are identifiers that are considered so integral, so a part of our identities that we put them first, like race and religion. So there is plenty of precedent for it, even though if it's new to your ear, it sounds really odd and actually like something that you've probably been taught not to say for a very long time. Oh, sorry. And so I think this question of whose role is it to change is a really good one because it goes into that primary prevention concept. Again, in the past, the idea of preventing, and this is my frame, but the idea of preventing violence was oftentimes put on the victim in the past of, oh, she shouldn't have worn a short skirt, she shouldn't have gone to that party, et cetera, et cetera. And now as a culture, as a larger society, we've been moving to, oh, we need to make sure that our young people don't grow up to harm other people. We need to figure out why that's interpreted as an invitation, et cetera. And so the social model I actually see as very, has a lot of overlap with concepts of primary prevention, as actually it's on the larger community to create a space in which people with disabilities have access rather than the emphasis on curing that disability. Does anyone want to add to this or have questions about this? This is a pretty big one.
Can I make a comment?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, whenever the term "we need to fix this,"
Mm-hmm.
what it does to a person with a disability, especially children who are dealing with it from birth, it come across that they're broken and they're not whole, and it gets devoured into their psyche and into their self-concept, and that they're never okay because the medical community is always trying to fix them.
Right.
So that means they're broken and that they're not whole. And they need to change that terminology of fix them or fix it.
Right. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Anna. It's really important, and I can't emphasize enough just how critical it is that we shift our understanding about it. You know, I hear from a lot of folks still in the disability community who want both, right? They want medical interventions and support, but they want that social model that accepts as we are. And you know, oftentimes, and this is where so many of you in your role are so critical, is that parents don't know. You know, they're trying to get resources and they're being guided by lots of people. And, you know, there was someone in my life recently whose son was just diagnosed as autistic. And, you know, she just didn't know where to go. And everyone was like, oh, you need to start correcting his behavior now. And having that guidance for how to think of this to best support folks is so critical. Thanks for adding that, Anna. Anyone else before we move on? Okay. So disability justice, this is another drawing from Michael Bazant, means resisting together from solitary cells to open air prisons. To exist is to resist. So if you want more resources about disability justice, this is more of an anti-ableism training than a disability justice training. Disability justice is actually huge because it's super intersectional. Um, it's really about cross-disability organizing, which is to say um, people with mobility disabilities, also working with folks with mental health disabilities and chronic illnesses, et cetera, et cetera. Because oftentimes folks get access, only one group of people get access. And so that cross disability organizing is really important. It also weaves in intersectional analysis, looking at capitalism, et cetera. So if you want to know more, you can always do some Googling around disability justice. There's great resources there. And we also have some resources, and I'll have my email at the end if you want to email us. We have a little packet we can send you. This is another quote from Sebastian. Jorge, do you want to read it?
Yes, I enjoy reading this by Sebastian. We are ourselves enough. Pivot this way, shed your fear, stop your flight, lean toward disability and illness. Turn back this way, turn back towards us, turn back towards yourselves and your kin. Sebastian Margaret.
Thank you. I think this is such a great going again on that idea that we started out at the beginning of finding ways that we can lean towards more wholeness as a community, and the inclusion that we really are moving towards is both for ourselves with disabilities and for our family and community members. That's what's going to build protection and support. So I wanted to, my last group was so much more talkative. So we have some time for questions, thoughts that you have. Cool. Well, thank you so much for being here today and for all of your work. I meant to thank you actually more at the start of this. You all are holding so very much, and the fact that you're also investing in understanding more and figuring out how to support the people that you work with more is just really great. So thank you, and I hope you and your loved ones stay well during this time.